Welcome to The Real Story with Jeanne Ives. This interview is different than my normal interviews. This interview is with an outstanding author who lives right here in Wheaton. He's lived here for quite a while. He's got a storied background as an intelligence officer in the Navy. And he's written a number of books, thrillers, military espionage thrillers. But he's also written a new book called My Autobiography by Joe Biden. It's a complete parody. It's quite interesting, but a little bit more about Eric Wentz, my guest today, who's in studio. Eric was born in a small town in southern Pennsylvania, where as a boy, he learned how to hunt, fish, and read. Wow, that's great. Both the written word and signs of nature after years of an almost transient life as the son of a naval officer. The family settled in Ohio, where he attended Jesuit College Preparatory High School in Cleveland, St. Ignatius. There he was engaged in athletics and learned to love the quest for knowledge, a quest nurtured by the Jesuits, who played such a prominent role in his first novel. Later, he continued under their tutelage as a student at Cincinnati Xavier University, majoring in English and social studies. He put these two disciplines together with a lifelong interest in writing poetry, and you'll notice a lot of poetry if you do pick up his book, My Autobiography by Joe Biden. I see a lot of it in there because I did go through it last night. Anyway, he's also studied archaeology, and he has an understanding of military battle tactics and logistics. He taught and coached in the Cincinnati area before attending Ohio State University, or is it the Ohio State University? We were having a little conversation about that beforehand. Anyway, he's got a master's in applied linguistics and Italian. So that's interesting. His teaching success is mirrored in his career as a naval officer in the United States Reserves. He had the opportunity to travel widely and worked with the Department of Defense. And his background in military affairs and linguistics enables him to spin his tales with delight and factual precisions. He's married with 4 children, and we're so happy to have you in studio with us. So where did this all begin? What's your first story to tell our audience, Eric?
Well, first of all, Jeanne, thank you very much for having me on your program. But I was thinking about this even before I got here today. And given that I grew up in a military household, my father was career military, which was World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And my father started out in the Marine Corps. But later on, after Korea, he switched to the Navy. And one day I did ask my dad, I go, why did you do that? He said, I had a checkered disciplinary career in the Marine Corps. And he said, you can only get busted so many times for fighting with your own men when they decide you're probably not good officer material. And so he said, I thought with the Navy I could start over again. He said, I was a little bit older, a little bit wiser. But if I can narrate one story that I think brings me into the picture as well, and the relationship that we had, which so obviously influenced me. At one point, when I was very active in the reserves in the Navy, I would frequently go up to Great Lakes Naval Station to do training, or I would go up to Fort Sheridan, among other locales in the immediate vicinity. One point, my dad says, well, I'm going to come and visit you. And he said, I'll be there on such and such a day. When my dad arrives, he realizes that, and he saw my uniforms hanging up and so forth. He said, do you ever go up to Great Lakes Naval Station? And I said, I go up there all the time, Dad. He goes, do you mind if we go up there? And I thought, since my dad had spent most of his career when he was stateside, he was in California or Charleston, South Carolina, or the Washington, D.C. area, someplace the coastal environments, let's put it that way.
Absolutely.
And during World War II, he, of course, and Japan, the South Pacific, and Korea.
Sure. Just to pause there, I mean, most people don't think about the Midwest having a naval base, but Great Lakes is a big naval base.
It is the largest naval training base in the world for new recruits. At any one time, they could have, typically don't, but they could have as many as 30,000 people right there on base. So my dad says, do you want to go? I said, do you ever go up there? I said, sure, I do. He said, do you mind if we go up? I said, okay. And I thought it's because he had never been there.
You wanted to go to the PX or something?
Well, I thought it's because he had never been there before.
Okay.
So my dad, we drive into the base, and my dad says, turn left here. I go, what? He goes, turn left here. And he says, turn right here. And I said, Dad, have you been here before? He says, oh, yeah. I says, pretty interesting experiences, too. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, he said, the Japanese did not all surrender in August of 1945. the renegade battalions continued fighting in China. And he said, I was part of the 6th Marines. And he said, we were disappointed to find out we weren't going home. We'd been overseas for over 2 years. He said, they told us you're going to China to track down the renegade Japanese battalions, and you better be prepared for the worst. They were expecting bonsai charges and so forth, suicide charges. So my dad said, we didn't come home in 1945. He said, we didn't come home until the winter of 1946 because we had to track these guys down. So my dad said, well, and I asked him, I said, well, what's that have to do with Great Lakes? He said, well, when we finally did get to come home, he said, they took us from San Francisco, put us on trains, and he said, if you were a Marine that lived west of the Mississippi, you were on one train. Everybody east of the Mississippi was going to go to Great Lakes, and then they would distribute you throughout the rest of that part of the country. My dad said, you have to remember, we hadn't been home in several years. He said, so we come to Great Lakes. And he said, this Marine gunny comes in, and he's talking to all of us. He says, now, gentlemen, we understand you've been away for a while. You can go into Chicago, but we don't want to hear anything about any bad behavior. And moreover, you're not allowed to wear your uniforms. My dad said, none of us asked the obvious question, which was, what are we supposed to wear? He said, that's all we had. And he said, we'd been on the train for several days. He goes, we really weren't in a pleasant mood. So he said, finally, he left, and the first thing we did was find out, where do you get the train to go into Chicago? We found out. He said, we piled in several cars into Chicago. And my dad said to me, have you ever heard of Rush Street? I go, yeah, Dad, Rush Street's very famous. He said, well, he said, when we went there were a lot of bars, few restaurants, but a lot of bars. He said, we went into one. He said, we were having a really good time. And he said, we were joking around and drinking. And he said, then a bunch of squids walked in. For those of you who may not know, squid is a somewhat pejorative term for sailors in the Navy. My dad said, and he paused, and he said, it was the best fight we had ever had. He said, by the time we were through, we had pretty much broken up the bar. He said, somebody called the police. He said, even guys that weren't in the fight, he goes, they arrested everybody, sailors and Marines. He said, so we're all sitting in jail in Chicago wondering who's going to call the Marine who told us you can go into Chicago, but we don't want to hear anything about any bad behavior. He said, finally, about 2:30 in the morning, that person is down there talking to the police. They agreed to let us all out, sailors and Marines, but they commandeered the trains of the Northwestern. And they had to have special arrangements made to put the Marines in this car, sailors in this car. And he said, when we finally get back to Great Lakes Naval Station, he said, as we got off the train, there was a gauntlet of police and shore patrol, military police, so that we didn't step out of line. He said, we finally get into the barracks, and the same guy who had warned us comes in. He says, thanks to you gentlemen, the entire base is closed down for the weekend. Nobody's allowed to leave, and you cannot leave the barracks until your train arrives. If you have to wait 7 days, 10 days, it doesn't matter. You're staying inside until then. And then my dad asked me, he says, do they still have that rule in Chicago where you can't wear a military uniform into a restaurant? I said, they do. Most of them probably don't know enough to enforce it. But I said, I've been asked to leave because I was in a military uniform.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I didn't know that was a rule.
My dad laughed. He says, well, I'd like to think I played my small part in Chicago culture.
That's a great story. Oh, my gosh. Speaking of which, coming up, Army-Navy game. Mm-hmm. We should make maybe a friendly bet on that.
All right.
Well, you can think about it over the course of the interview. I mean, I've got a son at West Point, so if you need that West Point sweatshirt, we could bet on that, or I don't know.
Okay, let me think about that.
Or the bathrobes actually are a lot nicer now than when I was there. I mean, we got the scratchy wool ones. Now they have this plush velvet bathrobe. Maybe you need one of those.
Okay.
You let me know, but we should make a bet on the Army-Navy game.
All right, well, you know what's going to happen now. I'm going to be betting with my children as well. I want you to know, since they're both Army.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so you're on the Army side.
Well, no, I'm still on the Navy side.
Oh, okay, but, you know. Yeah, well, you can have a side bet with them.
Okay.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is my son, who's the Navy pilot, is actually a West Point graduate. So the Army-Navy game rolls around. He's always on his alma mater side, of course,
Yeah.
right? So that he's been thrown in the river a few times when Army won. So it's good. It's all fun, all good.
Yeah.
It's great. Well, I mean, this is just it's amazing though. So I mean, let's go first to this though. How do you actually sit down and start to write a fictional book like you've written? What do you know the ending before you begin the book? Does it develop along the way? How do you even have? I mean, it takes a lot of attention span to write a book.
I think mentally, anybody that writes does have a scaffold mentally.
Okay.
But along the way, you may find yourself diverging here or there and say, you know what I thought was going to be the ending isn't the ending. For example, when I wrote my first novel, which was Piercing the Veil, I wrote that anticipating that would be my only fictional work regarding special operations that take us into Africa and so forth. But then midway through, I realized I need at least 3 other books, maybe 4 other books, to put this whole thing together. And if I can give you an overview of what I've done with that.
Absolutely.
Because I have a background in literature, and that includes Old English, such as actually...
What helped you more? Your background in literature and your being well-read, or was it more important that you could capture your audience with your technical knowledge about military operations? Which do you think was
I think the military was probably key.
Okay.
Now, I say that also knowing that I probably wouldn't have had the success that I've had, except that I had read a good deal. And the overarching symbolism of my books, and many people don't get this, but I have a friend who teaches at the University of Arkansas, and he teaches medieval languages and history, and hence Chaucer, and he teaches Beowulf in Old English, among other things. He's one of the people that got it right away. He said, "You are retelling the Arthurian legends with a modern backdrop." I said, "You got it."
Oh,
I said, "I took the story of Werner von Eschenbach, who was a knight in the Middle Ages, who wrote the original Arthurian stories that we all know, and it takes several hundred years for them to develop." And I thought, you know what? This is the story of honor as it is perceived in the Middle Ages. But I've always thought that the highest factors that influence the best behavior in the U.S. military is a code of honor that emanates from a knightly code. They may not always call it that, but my stories are essentially the story of knighthood in the modern world. So that was the umbrella concept. Then I was able to people it with real individuals, all of whom have had their names changed.
Okay, so these are they're real individuals in your books, names changed. How about the operations you describe? Are they real operations to some degree?
I have to be careful here.
Okay.
I can say that they are based upon, but I would never use the real ones because then you get into dicey territory.
Sure.
And I didn't want to jeopardize that or anything or anybody that I ever knew. So I've always steered clear of that, and I've been very careful. But the other thing about all of it is, at a certain point, there's a labor involved in this. And when you're working full-time, whether you're with the Navy overseas or someplace else, it's difficult to get uninterrupted time. So there was a point at which I simply said this: I'm going to write 15 minutes tonight because I know I won't be able to stay awake any longer. When it's 12 hours on, 12 hours off, a lot of time you don't have time for this. And when I was overseas in particular, I could sketch out ideas, but I really couldn't devote myself to the task and its completion until I came back to the United States and had some leisure time.
So you were sketching the stories while you were still part of the military, and then wasn't until after you retired completely, after a 27-year career, that you finally said, "I'm going to start to put these stories together." Is that what you're telling me?
Essentially. Now, I should add that I had an advantage in that the military, early on recognizing my writing skills, there were people who would come to me and say, "Listen, I have a presentation I have to give in about 6 hours, and I haven't been able to attend to it. I need someone to write a speech." And I'd say, "Well, sir, what's it on?" And he says, "Well, this is it."
It's on Beowulf.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
How
How
long is it supposed to be? He says, "I don't know. What do you think?" I said, "I don't know. Who's your audience?" And so that happens several times.
It's not a skill that's taught at all.
No.
In the military. You don't get taught that. Yeah.
So I said, I don't know, but I think I can. I said, but sir, you have to remove me from the immediate environment where I'm working with people and interacting. I said, I need a room entirely to myself with no interruptions.
Absolutely.
And I got it. So over the years, every now and then when I'd be tasked with something, I need a room entirely to myself. And I think that the advantage I had was that I had written under pressure before, and I had written factual material. Writing a fictionalized version of some of those events was absolutely essential in order for me to get it past the censors, military censors.
So did you have to have your books checked by a military censor?
In fact, I won't even tell you the name of some of the people,
Okay.
but one of the people called me one day, and he said, I want you to know I read your book. And I said, and? He said, I really like it. He said, however, he said, I want you to change that name because he said, I know who that person is in real life. He says the description's too close. He said, you do that. He goes, you're good to go. So I go, okay, that's not a problem. But there are a number of instances where I wrote things for the military that were several hundred pages long, and I never got any public credit. It would say simply from the command of. And I look and go, I wrote it. And the other thing is in academia, you have to write a doctoral dissertation. You have to write a master's thesis. When I was at The Ohio State University, I had to write a master's thesis in linguistics, which was actually the hardest thing I've ever done. And it was just really mind-boggling and very difficult. But that was a type of discipline. But writing for academic circles and writing fictional material that will have a larger audience and it could be more readily understood by those other than the professors and so forth, I found that's a different type of writing. And I had to make sure I left the academic pedagogy behind me.
Sure. Okay, that's interesting. So are you telling me then that I should read Piercing of the Veil first, and then I should read Praying in Iran?
No, I would go.
What are you saying? How are you saying that we should
Piercing the
stack
Veil
these?
first.
Okay.
Okay. And
These are his books, by the way, for my listening audience. These are the books you can look at. I'm on Amazon.com. You can read all about Eric Wentz. You can read about his books there.
Piercing the Veil was the first one,
Okay.
and the protagonist is a man by the name of Lieutenant Commander Grant Chisholm. And at one point, my son-in-law, who's retired Army, said to me, he goes, why is the hero of the story Navy and not Army? I said, because I'm in the Navy. He goes, oh, okay. So,
But your son-in-law, which you can decide if you want to talk about him or not, he's kind of a badass.
he is, and he has numerous black ops under his belt, and he is a renowned individual within military circles.
And your daughter, who he's married to, is
just
also
retired as a major in the U.S. Army.
Yes.
And my son is also a major in the Army, and his wife's also a major in the Army. So when we get together, even if we're in a public venue, in a restaurant or something like that, we can speak in code just by using a series of acronyms. And no one will understand.
Well, we can kind of do that in the Ives household.
Okay.
Yeah, because my husband, it was West Point. I was West Point. I've got one son who graduated from West Point, another son at West Point, and I have a son who was an Army Ranger.
Well, there you go.
So we can sort of speak in codes, too.
Yeah.
And the other two kids are pretty cool, too, just for the record. I need to put that on the record.
Yeah. But back to the whole idea of writing. When I was in
Yes.
grade school, I had an experience that I think kind of galvanized things. I hated school. Grade school, I hated it. I don't mean I disliked it. And my dad was frequently gone. He was overseas and so
Sure.
forth. And my mother would always use this threat. She goes, wait till your father comes back. I remember one day I made the wrong statement. I go, yeah, in 6 months. Well, my mother, who grew up in an Italian household, did not cotton to that, as they say. And she slapped me. And I thought, sometimes you just can't stop. I go, that didn't hurt. Yeah, it just, and she goes, once again, it was wait till your father gets home. Well, I was afraid of my dad, but I wasn't afraid of my mom. And so my mom would try to prompt me to do better in school. I'm not kidding. When we lived in Southern California, I would leave at recess. Any chance I got, I would leave at recess. I had fishing gear stowed underneath a pier. So much so, I missed 90 out of 180 days, and they couldn't corral me. I could move faster than the teachers could on the playground, and I would just disappear. And then finally, my mother said, that's it. And my father came back from an overseas assignment, and I'll never forget this. They walked into the kitchen. I hadn't seen my dad in about a year. Walked into the kitchen, they're going to have a conversation. When they come out, my mother fulfilled her threat. My father always had a threat for me. The threat was this: if you don't shape up, you're going to go to a military school. And I thought, oh boy. And I thought that could really happen. But my dad wasn't Catholic, but my mom was. And my mom said, if you don't shape up, we're going to send you to the nuns. Now, that scared me because I thought I had seen the kids in the Catholic schools where they would wear the suit.
I went to a Catholic school.
Well, I saw the tie,
abused,
and I thought, oh, no. I said, and I thought, my dad won't put up with that. I was wrong. They sent me to the nuns. The first thing they did, they put me back a full year. I flunked the 5th grade. I had to do it again. The next time through, I only missed 30 days. And that's because they got on to me early on. And the nuns would make me stand next to them at recess until they thought they could trust me, because they thought I would disappear. And one day I did. My mom dropped me off so that I wouldn't dilly-dally on the way to school. I walked in the front door, walked right out the back door, waiting for her to leave. And the nuns called home to let her know. And she found me walking down the street toward a pier where I had fishing gear stowed. So I got caught. But then finally...
You're just a regular old Huck Finn.
Well, Huck's an important character in my story.
Yes, I caught that.
But at a certain point, I did shape up. And part of it was I had never had a male teacher, and it made a difference. Because at a certain point, and I'll never forget his name, Mr. Anthony Rocco. And he was an Army veteran, and he was very tough. But he would do things like this. He goes, after school, anybody want to toss the football around? A teacher wants to play with us? And he would toss the football, and he would talk to us, and we didn't know what he was doing. He'd go, have you ever considered where you're going to go to high school? And at that point, I hadn't. He said, well, he talked to me one day. He goes, Eric, do you ever think of going to, he mentioned Cleveland St. Ignatius. He says, you like to read a lot, which I did. I liked to read. Mm-hmm. I grew up on classic comic books. I may not have read everything that they had intended in school, but I always read my classic comic books. So I knew who Moby Dick was. I knew about Huck Finn.
Sure.
I had read The Scarlet Pimpernel. I'd read all this stuff, and people actually thought, boy, he really knows this literature. I didn't want to let on where I was getting all my materials from.
Oh, Cliff Notes version.
But when I went to the 8th grade, the combination of that, we had to figure out where we're going to go to high school. I applied to several different high schools in Cleveland, and my primary reason for doing so wasn't academics. I had read a book about the Jesuit martyrs of North America. I thought, I want to be a Jesuit martyr, but I want to play football too. So I thought, in order for me to play football, I better wait until I can't get killed first. So anyway, I ended up, and then I wrote, I was in a contest in, it was sponsored by the primary radio program in the Midwest, and in 25 words or less, what would you tell the people behind the Iron Curtain about the United States? Well, I was one of the 3 winners.
That's fascinating.
And I was broadcast all over Radio Free Europe, and I was still in grade school.
That is fascinating because that is something our generation does not understand. So I grew up at a time when there was the Iron Curtain. We talked about it a lot. We read novels about it in 6th grade. Our teacher we would get engrossed in like this listening after lunch. She would literally take like a chapter a day and read to us about this Iron Curtain story. And I mean, I really remember her doing that. And it was fascinating to me that this is the world that we lived in, right? You just can't even believe it. But our kids take all of that for granted. They didn't grow up with the, Checkpoint Charlie, the Berlin Wall, none of that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's to their detriment, quite frankly. North Korea, that's far away. Don't even think about it. China, that's where I get my iPhone from, right? They don't really understand what tyranny looks like in full force. They can't actually go and experience a Checkpoint Charlie. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so you write 25 words. What do you remember your message?
The essence of it was that America was a living mosaic. And I had heard the term salad bowl, but personally to me, it's just like, I didn't like the term, so I said, it's a living mosaic. And my teacher really liked it. He goes, you should send this into this contest. I didn't even know about it. And then I found out I was one of 3 winners that they selected, and we had our stuff broadcast over Radio Free Europe and locally as well. And so at least for a few days, I was a celebrity in my grade school. And I think it was also indicative of the fact that I did have at least a mild influence coming from my teachers who were politically astute. And here's the thing, they were also veterans. And I think that made a difference.
At your Jesuit high school?
Well, at this point, school. I was still in grade school. And then when I go to the Jesuit high school, there was one teacher I had who landed at Normandy. He was a priest, but he was at the time he was not. And he lands at Normandy on D-Day. And then when I went to Xavier University, the president of the university was a Father O'Connor. Father O'Connor was the chaplain on board the USS Missouri when the Japanese surrendered. So I thought that was interesting that these ties...
We just don't have that. We don't have that in our schools anymore. Less than 0.5% of Americans even serve in uniform ever. And you know, even fewer, and about 1% of people even have any connectivity to somebody who serves in uniform. And you're at the state now where only about 21 to 23% of American boys aged 18 to 24, or American young men, aged 18 to 24, are even eligible for service because we've got a population that is out of shape, overweight, criminal records, can't even pass basic GEDs, mental health issues, drug issues, and they are not capable of serving. And so you've got this dwindling people that you can even draw from the volunteer force. And then you've got a whole lot of other people that are all comfortable thinking that it is somebody else's duty to serve this country. So what I like to do is, like, if somebody said, oh, hey, if you're a veteran in the audience, stand up. And I went up to the speaker afterwards and I said, you know what? You really should, I think that's fine. That's great. Recognize the veterans in the audience. But what you should do then additionally is say, if you have a son, a daughter, son-in-law, daughter-in-law, whatever, if you have somebody in your immediate family who is serving, I also want you to stand up. Why? Because you are supporting or encouraging that type of service, and we need it. We need it because we need those veterans actually to disperse throughout the greater society and bring that experience to bear on the younger generation.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and we see the problem has been compounded where the recruitment quotas, some of them are 50% below where they should be, and then compounding it is the whole issue of the vaccine, where you've had the National Guard, I thought was particularly hard hit because a number of them said, I'm not taking the vaccine, and then you do see that probably in January, the Republicans are going to introduce legislation that says all those people have to be reinstated with back pay. But what's disturbing to me is that despite all the material coming out, including the Navy whistleblowers, a number of doctors have said, we have never seen so many young people dropping dead inexplicably. And they've said things like, we're not saying for sure it's the vaccine, but we also can't rule it out now, and we want to take a look at it. And they've been reprimanded, but now they have a certain amount of protection. And they're saying, we need to do something, and at the same time, currently, our Congress, or the White House, is doing nothing to alleviate that problem. And I know several young men, including my own youngest son, they're going, I'm not getting the vaccine. They'll take anything else, but I say, I'm not getting the vaccine, and therefore I'm not going to join. And these are people that were actually looking at that possibility. And I know, you speak of your daughter, I know some young women that have said, there's no way because someday I want to have children. And they're concerned about the fact this is
it's an experimental vaccine.
Right.
That's what they ended up getting.
And here's what I always tell people. If you have any questions about this, take a look at the Nuremberg Code, which we wrote after World War II. The United States and Great Britain, France, Russia, all of the European powers signed it. Statement number 1 of the Nuremberg Code, the lessons of Nuremberg experimental vaccines and other things used on prisoners of war and people in the various concentration camps. Statement number 1, first sentence. No one may be compelled to take an experimental vaccine. We wrote that. It's still in vogue. We're ignoring it.
Shamefully. Shamefully ignoring it. I can't tell you how upset I am about it. So I wrote a Facebook post about it just the other day because finally they did decide to lift the vax mandate as part of the negotiation on the defense budget. How shameful is that, too? This should have just been done outright and done months ago, by the way. But, you know, they always have to negotiate a deal. This is just like some of the worst. These are the worst politicians I've ever come into contact with. It's very depressing, quite frankly, but we're going to stay in the fight and get this sorted out. Hey, back to your books, because another piece of information that just broke today is the fact that we are trading out, and I got to get his name right here. We are trading out this,
The basketball star.
The basketball star for this other
Brittany
guy,
Griner.
Victor Bout. Okay, so I got to tell you.
We're trading an NBA celebrity.
Yes.
Women's NBA celebrity for one of the world's worst traffickers in illegal arms.
Okay, and a trafficker of arms with Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, Africa. And I look at just kind of the background of your books. Is there any play in maybe a Victor Bout and his what he did as part of the background for some of your books? Did it play into any of it?
Well, there is a character who will be somewhat reminiscent of that person. That's all I can say.
Yes, of course.
But
because your books do center on that part of the world.
Right. And I've worked over there. I worked in Armenia, and I worked in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I have a hobby that enables me to go places, and I don't have to pretend that I'm working at a given moment, and I just delight in this. It's archaeology. And archaeology lets you see aspects of the world you might otherwise just walk past. And I also think it gives you a perspective on history, because sometimes
I've been to Ephesus.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
But sometimes parts of the world, they go, why? As Americans go, what are they fighting about that battle for? What are they? That battle happened 800 years ago. Well, Americans have short-term memory.
They sure do.
And you go, okay, well, the Turks defeated the people in Kosovo, the Serbs, and their ancestors in the 1300s, and they're still angry about it to this day. An American might say, well, you can't be serious. I go, yeah, it's called the day that we shall remember. In other words, we're never going to forget you defeated us on that day, and the Ottoman Empire went into the Balkans, okay? But I've been over there, and you go, they haven't forgotten. It's fresh in their memory like it happened yesterday. And I think when you go to archaeological sites or you go to historic battle sites, it gives you a perspective. We may not think it's important, but they do. And that's something we should know. And I think sometimes we get ourselves in really perilous situations because we don't understand and we're not savvy on the local culture. And let me give you one prominent example that to this day I think resonates with anybody that will listen. We all recall what happened during the Islamic Revolution when Ayatollah Khomeini took over, okay? What was interesting is that the Canadians, among others, tried to warn us. And you say, well, how did they know? They were sitting in coffee shops, and they overheard the students who led that. Ahmadinejad was one of those students who eventually becomes the head of the government over there. They were sitting there talking, but they were speaking in Farsi. The Canadians had Farsi translators on. So did the British. The United States had over 200 people in our embassy over there. Do you know how many of them spoke Farsi?
0?
One.
One.
Do you know who he was?
No.
A Marine reservist there on temporary assignment. He was going to be leaving in several weeks. And you have to ask yourself, who would be so stupid? And my answer is...
So you're saying it was a total intelligence failure?
Completely. Because even when the Canadians tried to warn us, we said we had we had no corroborating evidence of our own. Well, how could you? You don't speak the language. And at a certain point, I go, this is sheer stupidity. How can you take for granted what the opposition might be doing if you don't at least understand the language? Moreover, you don't understand the culture. And I think we put ourselves in a perilous situation.
Yeah, so this is interesting because they talk about cultural understanding in school today. And the cultural understanding that they are completely missing is the larger world culture that we need to have a better understanding with.
I would say
opinion.
it a little bit differently. They don't understand local cultures. They do understand a world culture emanating out of Davos, Switzerland.
Okay.
Okay? And if I were to make it analogous to anything, I would say it's analogous to what we saw before World War I, where there was a kind of camaraderie, worldwide camaraderie, about people in a certain social class. The Tsar was related, for example, to Queen Victoria.
Yes.
Queen Victoria could address her nephew in Germany as Willy instead of Kaiser Wilhelm. They all got along reasonably well. What they didn't understand was the local culture and the differences at times that would cause things to flare up. And if you take a look at the events that start World War I with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, even the head, Archduke Ferdinand, when he goes to southern Balkans, he doesn't understand the day of remembrance, the day when we shall remember. And the Serbs are not happy that this Austro-Hungarian oligarch, monarch, picks that day of all days to come to their territory. And the result is something we all know about. Okay? But if he had known, if someone said, look, don't go, pick another day. But he didn't.
And World War I begets World War II. Yeah. It's just fascinating. I mean, history does repeat itself, too, if we're not careful. You know, we're going to make the same sort of cultural mistakes if we're not aware of what's going on.
I couldn't agree more. I think that we are woefully lacking in terms of true cultural awareness. Let me give you an example.
Historical stuff. I mean, you can even go to the Mideast, the classic Israeli-Egypt conflict, the Lebanese and the Israelis. If you don't understand your biblical history and what you have to go that far back, because these people have a long memory when it comes to that.
It's one of those conversations when I'm over there, I avoid certain topics. I don't even say the word Israel if I'm in an Arab country. I thought, this can't go in a good direction. And I'm not always right.
I got a story for you.
Go ahead.
So we were living in Germany, and my husband's uncle and aunt were living in Alexandria, Virginia, because he was there with a large construction company trying to really build their infrastructure. And so we went over there for Thanksgiving for 10 days to Alexandria, Virginia. And of course, it's just completely different. And actually, the month before that, we were fortunate enough to spend 8 days in Turkey, back when Turkey was far more modernized. And we had a friend, one of our classmates from West Point, his parents lived in Izmir. And so we flew in on a military flight hop. We got a hot $10 hop over there. Spent 8 days in Izmir with them, staying with them. They took us everywhere. It was fascinating. Went, to Ephesus, like I said before, and all this other stuff. And then a month later, we go to Turkey. Egypt. Turkey was sort of third world-ish. Egypt was so much further behind. I mean, they hadn't figured out really how to even get rid of, they still had outhouses and all that stuff back then. It was fascinating. Anyway, so we took a trip into Egypt, into Cairo, and went to the Cairo Museum. And it's very, like no photography, no anything. Of course, I don't understand anything that there's the signs. I'm just like, okay, whatever. So there is King Tut's, his entire setup there that they had. And the docent's talking and giving some instructions on stuff, and they never really said don't use photography, but I saw somebody else use flash photography, so I took a picture. They chased me out of that museum so fast, wanted my camera, and I said, no, you're not taking my camera. But we had to exit that museum. They were very, very strict about it. And then we were going through the alleys and of Egypt, and got caught up in literally a funeral. Everybody's in black. Everybody's head to toe black, and the coffin is up above everybody's head as they're marching it through the streets of Cairo. It's like, wow, this is just such a different culture.
Well, at one point we had exercises with the Turks. Okay, and I'll never forget this because we had someone in my unit, and we were overseas at the time, and he spoke Turkish, but they didn't know that.
I love Turkey, by the way. Loved it.
Well, So we have to work with the Turks, and we had a certain respect for them because they are fighters, and they have the largest military in Europe. People forget that. When you look, they have about 90 million people, and all the young men are expected to be military capable. Okay, that's more than Germany, France, England, any of them have. So on this particular occasion, if you didn't know what the cultural divide was between the American and the Turks, they let it slip out. We were approaching them, and they're talking, and they go, "Here comes the fags from America." You go, "What's that based upon?" You can talk about gays. You can talk about transgenders. Not over there. In other words, they have a certain disrespect for us because of those issues. So culturally, you can say what you want, but there is a cultural divide. And if you wonder why Hungary today, under Viktor Orban, why he got reelected, culturally, they're not on the same page with us any longer. They may have been in the 50s and 60s, but they're not now. Poland is also pushing back. So there are cultural issues at the local level, I think, that by and large we don't understand. And if you understand this, and I know this is something a lot of people might not agree with me on.
Okay.
You don't understand the war in Ukraine if you don't understand Russian Orthodox religion.
Okay, can you go into that a little bit further?
Yes.
Because this is a current topic. We want to.
Okay. And if you take a look at Vladimir Putin's background, when Vladimir Putin took over, there were only 3,000 churches that had survived the communist era. The largest country in the world had 3,000 churches left. They had largely been pillaged, destroyed, turned into warehouses in the days of the Soviet Union. Today, there are over 33,000 Russian Orthodox churches operating in Russia. Vladimir Putin subjects himself to an immersion baptism in the Russian Orthodox Church. He goes into a river. In other words, he's reaffirming the ancient, historic, local traditions of the Russian people. If you don't understand that, you don't understand why there hasn't been a revolution thus far. And part of it is that the Russian church supports him because he has supported them in ways that no one else has since the days of the Tsar. And if you don't get that picture, and I think many Americans assume, well, the whole world will eventually be secularized and it'll adopt a worldwide model. And that's what you see coming out of Davos, Switzerland. Okay?
Heck, that's what you see coming out of the Vatican half the time, it feels like.
But
I say that as a Catholic.
But I think that's what we're missing as a society. And I don't think that if you watch the mainstream news media, they don't even know it. I don't think that they're ignoring it. They don't know
you raise
enough.
A good point. Last night I was with I was at a political event, and two ladies came up to me to discuss immigration, believe it or not. And they were both Russian. And one of them, they were U.S. citizens now, been here for 18 years. They were both Russian. And they were talking about how it's not fair because they came over here, they worked their butt off, they never got Medicaid, they never took food stamps, they never did anything. As soon as they possibly could, they got the first job that they could, and then they just moved up and they got their kid through school, and he's now a professional and all this stuff, really the American success story. But they worked for it every step of the way, and they see this unfettered immigration coming across the border, and they're just devastated by it. And I said, well, what do you think should happen with the Ukrainians that are now arriving? What support should they be receiving? And they're like, they just didn't want to have that conversation. They did not want the Ukrainians to have any undue support either. They wanted them to work for it, and they actually did. They're a little, they weren't interested in that conversation to talk about the Ukrainians. So there's something still going on.
There's no doubt about it. And I mean, they've been fighting off and on for several hundred years.
Right.
Okay. But they have, when you talk about coming here and succeeding the American way in somehow, the traditional notion that you come here, you work hard,
right,
and you achieve something. They have something going for them that, I think we sometimes fail to appreciate.
The Russians
and the Ukrainians.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
They come from a highly educated population. If you take a look at the history of the aerospace industry, you can't talk about it without talking about the Russians and the Ukrainians. If you take a look at some of the primary American designers in aircraft, some of those are immigrants that came from Russia or the Ukraine. And today, one of the more erudite industries is the cryptocurrency industry. Whether you think it's fake or real or not, you look at names like Vitaly Buterin. Okay, he came from Russia, and he's the guy, along with another individual, that creates Ethereum, which is one of the two probably most secure cryptocurrencies that many people still go into.
And we create Sam Bankman-Fried.
Right. So I think there is that educated electorate, though. That
who, by the way, is the child of two, Stanford professors, apparently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But going back to the whole issue of the border and what we see happening down there, that's not new. In fact, there was a paper written in the 1970s by two professors. I think they were from the University of New Mexico, and it's on how to make America to collapse America. And they said illegal immigration would be one of the means by which they would do it. And what they point to, they said, we will overwhelm the safety net. When the safety net collapses, then the American people will be ready for revolution. They're talking a Marxist ideology. You go, have they done that before? Yes. One of the traditional hallmarks of the communist usurpation of authority throughout the 20th century was they would flood an area with immigrants. The society locally collapses. Then they move in and restore order only under a new leadership. The other thing is, and I always tell people, look at what's actually happening as opposed to what's being said. You know right now the number one cause of death of young people in America is fentanyl.
Yes.
Fentanyl is coming from only one country in the world, China. They don't even ship into Long Beach or San Francisco any longer. They don't have to. They go straight to the drug cartels. The cartels carry it across the border. Nothing is being done to stop it. Nothing significant. Now, I say it's a deliberate ploy by China to weaken the will of the American people and to discourage us. And I think they're doing a pretty damn good job. Now, here's the rest of the story. It's the same thing that they did in Vietnam. In the 1960s and 70s, they bought large quantities of heroin, and they distributed it throughout South Vietnam, hoping to make it very easy for American GIs to get their hands on the drugs and also the South Vietnamese population, including the military. In other words, make sure they become drug addicts, and that will diminish their success on the battlefield. They've done it before, and I think they're doing it again right now. And frankly, we're too damn stupid to do anything about it.
Okay.
Not you and I, but I mean, there are enough people that don't realize
there's so many,
this is deliberate.
100%. It's deliberate. And you know what? You've got a lot of disinterested parents, quite frankly, who are allowing their children to get caught up in this, in my opinion. I'm going to blame some of the parents on this. I absolutely will. But the other thing, okay, but let's go there right now. COVID-19. Mm-hmm. Bioweapon, intentionally released or not?
I think it's quite intentional, and I think Fauci's part of the problem. I do not. I think Fauci the fraud is a very good appellation to apply to him.
Okay, well, let's just take this back because I could talk to you for all day, and we're going long here, and I actually would love to have you back for more. But so your next book, is it gonna be a bioweapon? Don't know yet. Do you have an idea?
I do have an idea.
You said you had a scaffolding for you're building this story, and we started out with we should read Piercing the Veil. What's the next book that you should read in order?
Then you want to read 0 to 100 Hours.
0 to 100 Hours.
And then you want to go to Praying in Iran, which deals with child sex trafficking, which, and I'm going to give you a heads up on this, anybody that's been there and has actually worked with certain international agencies knows that part of the problem is the United Nations. Not all good people. And some of the people involved in those activities working with children are the groomers and the people that are actually involved in the trafficking.
Okay.
I'll leave it at that.
All right. And we'll leave it with that as well. Thank you so much for this fascinating interview, Eric. I really appreciate it. Have a Merry Christmas. And what are we betting on, Army, Navy?
I still have to have some concern.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll get back to you with that. Thanks a lot. This was The Real Story with Jeanne Ives. Eric Wentz is the author. I highly recommend his books. Make great Christmas gift. Package up all three of them. This one's a little bit different.
It is political satire. And I will just tell you, the reviews are great. They're all 4 and 5 stars by reputable reviewers. And they've used words like scathing, vulgar, crass, but also brilliant, intriguing, one-of-a-kind, and outrageously funny. I'll take the latter several adjectives.
Okay, I can't resist. Nancy Pelosi apparently reviewed this book, and she wrote, "I hate this book, especially the part about me having an affair with Hunter. I may have, but that is beside the point." And it goes on from there. Great satire. Very funny book. These would make great Christmas gifts. Eric Wentz is our author. Great people that live in Wheaton here. Thank you so much for joining me on The Real Story with Jeanne Ives.